This is a deeper listen from KEXP. I'm Emily Fox. And today we're taking a deeper look at how we listen to music through the lens of Spotify. So coming up in 30 minutes, we'll hear from a musician who's able to pay off his mortgage and buy a new car from royalty payments from music streaming service Spotify. That's even though the general pay rate per one song streamed is 0.0035 cents, a fraction of a penny. And year after year, Spotify has engaged in more and more practices that impact independent artists, from outsourcing stock music that Spotify pays a lower royalty rate for, and then flooding their in-house playlists with that lower royalty rate stock music, to practices like paying artists a 30% lower royalty rate in exchange for promotion on Spotify. But first, I want to share a conversation with Liz Pelly.
I'm a music journalist and an author, and most recently, I've published this book called Mood Machine: The Rise of Spotify and the Costs of the Perfect Playlist.
In the book, Pelly details Spotify's various practices that have impacted independent artists over the years. Practices she argues promotes passive listening in the quest to curate moods from its in-house playlists. I caught up with Pelly to talk about all this. But first, we discussed the formation of Spotify, how Spotify, which is based in Sweden, came out of the piracy era. Pirate Bay is also based in Sweden. And by the time Spotify launched in its home country in 2006, major record labels had already tried their own streaming services without much traction.
The people who started Spotify weren't involved in the music business before they started this service. They were advertising people. Daniel Ek and Martin Lawrenson's backgrounds were in ad tech. And it seems pretty clear from researching that time period, looking at their own characterizations of the early history of the company, that it was really more of a business opportunity. And I think they saw an opportunity there to offer a platform that combined access to an enormous catalog of media supported by ads and for free to the user. That was the original Spotify business model, was a library of free streaming media accessible for free, supported by ads. And it was only through the negotiations with the major labels that they came up with this idea of the freemium model, where there also would be a subscriber tier. So understanding their backgrounds in advertising, the political climate of the life of piracy in Sweden, both of these can be interesting to think about as kind of like context for the rise of this company.
Yeah, I didn't realize that the major labels had tried to start their own streaming services. But, in reality, Spotify could not have taken off without the buy-in of the three major labels. And as you write in your book, Mood Machine: The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist, you write that the major labels control 70% of the recorded music market. And when Spotify launched, the major labels together owned 18% of the company. Now that's more like 6 to 7% now. But tell me more about just the power that the major labels have had on Spotify.
In order to have a service that has like most of what you would think of when you think of the history of popular recorded music, requires the participation of Sony, Universal, and Warner, the three major record labels, because they sit on the rights to so much of what we think of when we think of the history of popular recorded music. So that requires that those three companies sign licensing deals with the streaming services in order to make their catalogs available. And because they own so much of this music, it puts them in this incredible outsized position when it comes to negotiating. A major issue of the streaming era is that what's actually in those contracts is completely secretive, protected by NDAs. There's so much that the public doesn't know about what's in those contracts.
Do you have a sense of like what kind of deals they would get versus like, say, an indie label?
The only real glimpse that we've ever had into these contracts was this moment in 2016 when one of the early contracts between Sony and Spotify leaked to The Verge. Some things that we know about the early contracts between major labels and streaming services are that they, got these enormous advances to put their music on these services. They got equity in the company, free advertising on the platforms, influence over how these platforms evolve. They also have per user minimums on the free tier. So they have kind of more ideal royalty terms baked into these contracts in some ways. And yeah, I feel like in addition to what's contractually obligated, there's also just the reality that these companies are so big. They have so much marketing muscle behind them. They really have kind of like a lot of influence in general over the recorded music business. So, even beyond streaming relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it seems like what Spotify was really after was creating mood music or vibes through their playlists that you would see on their home screen, like, playlists called, deep concentration, peaceful meditation, or road trip, or dinner party. Can you talk about how Spotify used playlists to track data on like what made a song successful, and how once they found a successful song, they start plugging it in all these playlists? Like, Spotify seems to be so much about data, and also like looking at that data for what makes a good song and then using their playlist to proliferate that song. Can you just talk about that process?
Yeah. Something that I try to do in the book, because when streaming services first became popular, when a company like Spotify was first launched, it was really more like a search bar. You had to know what you wanted to listen to. So something I tried to do is kind of trace the moment when Spotify created its own first party playlist ecosystem. And there was this moment in 2013, towards the end of 2012, early 2013, where the company really started to kind of reimagine how it was positioning itself as a product. So around the end of 2012, Spotify really sort of started to kind of rebrand itself as not just a way to access all the music in the world, but as this product that was offering music for every mood and moment, and started repositioning itself as a platform that, knows your music taste better than you know it yourself. So one of the major strategic things that they did in 2013 during this era where they were sort of reimagining themselves as a curation service, not just as a library of music, was they bought this company called Tunigo, which was a app for what they called ready-made playlists. It was a Swedish company, and the team at Tunigo became Spotify's first in-house team of playlist editors. And one of the things that they brought to Spotify was, this idea for a sprawling playlist ecosystem that was kind of based on this radio model, where at the top there were these sort of flagship top tier genre playlists like Rap Caviar and Rock This and Hot Country. And then they also had these smaller, what they called feeder playlists or more niche playlists that were kind of had less followers. And it was this model where if they had this sort of like, local or emerging artist that they were being pitched on, they could like put one of their songs on one of the smaller playlists and then look at the user data and see, okay, which songs had high skip rates, which songs had low skip rates, which songs are people listening to. Like if a song is popular, we'll move it up to a bigger playlist. And then if it does well in that playlist, then we'll move it up to a bigger playlist. And in some ways, they still sort of use this narrative today to talk about their ecosystem of editorial playlists, where they talk about how, today's top hits is like the top of the pyramid as the most popular playlist on Spotify. And they still, in some ways, do talk about it as this kind of data-driven meritocracy.
Playlists, I understand, have also been a big deal for indie labels. Like you talked to one indie label for your book where 45% of their total revenue was coming from streaming, which I was kind of surprised by. How do you think Spotify has impacted independent labels overall?
In some ways, from my perspective, it is one of the most important consequences of the streaming model. As someone who comes from the independent music world, really cares about the sort of strength of the independent sector, you might say. I think something that is really unique about the streaming era is the way in which artists of all types have been sold on this sort of one-size-fits-all model. Streaming services were built from the beginning in partnership with major record labels. These are services and systems that are built in every way to prioritize, incentivize, and reward music that scales up. And it has consequences on like which types of independent musicians succeed and fail, like which types of independent musicians are able to financially support themselves. And I think, so much of this book and a narrative that has taken hold the past 10 years is how streaming has contributed to this broader devaluing of music. And I think especially as independent music fans, it's on all of us in some ways to be thinking like bigger about revaluing music in this era and like what are the ways of supporting independent music and independent retail and independent record labels and independent music media outside of these systems that can really sort of like contribute to strengthening independent music at a time when independent music has been sort of sold on this business model that's really like made for pop stars.
Mm-hmm. I mean, when I think about that independent record label saying that 45% of their total revenue is coming from streaming, yet the general sense is, per song streamed, you get 0.0035 cents, which isn't a lot. And so you kind of need a lot of streams in order to get that revenue. And what I also found interesting in this book is when you looked at Spotify's front page indie playlist in 2024, a quarter of the playlist was made actually by songs coming from major labels. Another quarter of that playlist was from smaller labels that were owned by the major labels. I mean, what do you think that says? Like, I'm curious if this idea that at least one independent label said, 45% of their income comes from streaming. Is that normal? I mean, it seems like you would have to get so much traction, and Spotify is built in a way that benefits the majors versus the indies.
I think one thing that is really important to think about in terms of the way in which streaming has impacted independent music too is that independent music fans have historically been more likely to pay for and directly support artists than a more kind of like mainstream music fan. And in some ways, I think one of the really negative impacts of streaming on independent music specifically has been that I think you can kind of think of streaming as a model that kind of convinced a certain type of independent music fan to stream instead of directly supporting artists.
I'm speaking with Liz Pelly, author of Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. And something that really struck me about this book is the rise of stock music or ghost artists on Spotify, and how Spotify worked with production companies for a cheaper royalty rate and then would promote these songs on their playlists. And, you write in your book that a Swedish daily newspaper reported that they found 20 songwriters were behind over 500 artist names, and those tracks were streamed millions of times. So when did this start happening, and how did this impact traditional music labels and independent artists?
This would have started around 2016, 2017. One of the first articles on the phenomenon of so-called fake artists on Spotify was in Music Business Worldwide, which is a trade publication. In 2016, there was a headline, Spotify is filling its playlists with fake artists to fit certain moods like lean back playlists, mood playlists, and the early reporting pointed out that it was impacting artists who make jazz, classical, ambient, and lo-fi hip-hop beats. At the time, Spotify directly addressed this and aggressively denied that they were creating these songs, but they never really denied the existence of a broader arrangement, which I think really sort of in some ways made a lot of people in the music business and music business reporters more curious about this. So over the years, you'd see posts on social media pop up every few years, someone saying, oh, I was listening to this study playlist and check this out. Like all of this album art looks like it's made with generative AI, and all of these artists can't be found through a Google search, and there's no bios. I think that these all might be fake. So in the reporting for the book, I was able to, through interviewing musicians, interviewing former employees, interviewing people who worked in the music business at the time, was able to sort of get a fuller look at this practice internally at Spotify. And And what I learned was that, it was around 2016, 2017 that this practice was first piloted and then eventually sort of presented as a formal practice at the company. There's a team of editors internally at Spotify who are assigned to look after what the company refers to internally as perfect fit content. So essentially, cheap stock music. So, it's a cost-saving initiative for them. And then there's this list of production companies that they have specific license arrangements with. And so those production companies in turn commission musicians. So one of the most interesting parts of reporting on this was talking to some of the musicians who actually have worked with these production companies about their experiences, sort of cranking out dozens of tracks at a time for these production companies, and then submitting them, but then also telling me things like, I don't really know the terms of the arrangement. I just submit my tracks and get paid, and I don't really know what happens after that. So there's this whole, it's been a very secretive practice there for a really long time. There's a lot of opacity and mysteriousness, even for the musicians who are making the music that ends up on these playlists.
Wow. And you also were able to get a lot of internal communications from Spotify. Like, it sounds like reading the book, you were able to get a bunch of just internal Slack messages, and you were able to find that there was also this push within Spotify to really push the staff that were curating these in-house playlists to also be putting, there was pressure for them to add a lot of the stock music to those playlists. Can you talk a little bit about what you were able to gather in terms of the internal pressure to use more of this stock music in internal playlists?
I was able to review internal correspondences and find examples of situations where the senior programming executives were directly going to editors and, reminding them about the existence of this material. And also even just simply getting to kind of review the way in which the percentage of this type of material on playlists is monitored internally, I think was really revealing. There's specific tooling that playlist editors at streaming services use to keep track of the content on these playlists. And one of the stats that they're monitoring is the percentage on every playlist of how much of the music is this PFC content. I think that in and of itself is really revealing, right? Like that there's even kind of an effort internally to track how much of this material is on every playlist.
Yeah. And I mean, in your book, you write, according to internal communications reviewed in 2023, the Spotify playlists Ambient Relaxation, Deep Focus, 100% Lounge, Bossa Nova Dinner, and Cocktail Jazz, these playlists were comprised of more than 90% of these stock lower royalty rates. So to me, that means that independent artists, of which you've interviewed for this book and learned about, that independent artist that gets put on a playlist that can start paying rent and things like that, they're going to be knocked off of these playlists, for the stock music, because the stock music is a lower royalty rate. And the fact that some of these playlists are made up of, 90% or more, of the stock music blows my mind.
Yeah. And those are really the musicians that I was thinking about a lot while reporting this part of the book. When you think about okay, well, what are the consequences of a practice like this? Something I heard was that executives of these companies or more senior staff of these companies would say things like, well, the average user doesn't know the difference and doesn't care either way. And I think that to think about the broader consequences of this type of practice, you also really need to be thinking about the musicians who make music in these traditions. We're talking about jazz, classical, ambient music, instrumental music more broadly, lo-fi hip hop beats, instrumental guitar playing. There are no shortage of musicians who make music in these genres and these traditions and these styles who are trying to figure out how to piece together a living in the streaming era. Something that has come up very often since this reporting has come out. I've been contacted by a number of musicians who have said things like, so glad that this practice is being revealed. I make instrumental music in this style and used to be on all these playlists and experienced firsthand having my music removed from these playlists and watching my streaming revenue be greatly diminished. And for when this practice was, first implemented, 2016, 2017, it was a time where independent artists were really being sold on the playlist economy. It was being sold as an important part of releasing and distributing music and promoting music. And there were a lot of independent artists who were starting to see these playlists as an important piece of their overall revenue.
In 2020, Spotify announced a program called Discovery Mode, which asked artists to accept a roughly 30% lower royalty rate in exchange for algorithmic promotion, which some people argue was, payola, the practice we saw decades ago where, artists or labels would pay off DJs to play their stuff. And then, in 2023, Spotify also said it would no longer pay royalties to songs that got less than 1,000 streams per year, which I feel like can be the case for a lot of independent artists. So I'm thinking between this demonetization of songs that are less than 1,000 streams and also this discovery mode, how do you think these practices impacted independent artists and labels?
I think something, especially with a program like Discovery Mode, that's important to realize is that it's mostly independent artists who are being sold on these opportunities, or sorry, I should say, quote unquote opportunities. I think that's kind of like one of the things that is so funny about a program like Discovery Mode is that it's really sold as this opportunity to accept a 30% royalty reduction in exchange for algorithmic promotion. And it is mostly independent artists that are impacted by the so-called quote unquote artist-centric royalty model, which is exactly what you just described. This part of it is this demonetization of tracks under 1,000 streams per year. And yeah, important to, I think, also remember that whole idea was created by Universal Music Group. The artist-centric royalty model is an example of, one of those policies that was made a requirement of a Universal Music Group license deal in recent years. These are practices that have a lot of consequences for independent music specifically. Also important context is how Spotify sort of positions independent musicians as one of its target customers rather than as a type of partner, the way they see major labels as like their partners in these services. So they see this as kind of like a way in which they're selling musicians on take a 30% royalty reduction on your track in exchange for algorithmic promotion. They're selling artists on pop-up ads and banner ads and sponsored shelves, which is like when you look at the homepage and there's like these rows of recommendations, they have this thing that's like a sponsored shelf. They see this as kind of like one of their products that they're selling to this other side of their marketplace, or they're seeing these musicians as customers. And I think that the reality that there's like a certain type of musician who is seen as a partner and a certain type of musician that is seen as a customer also is something that should give fans of independent music specifically pause as well.
So I'm curious, has Spotify responded to this book at all, or were you able to speak with anyone kind of at the higher end of the company? I'm curious what their take is on you presenting all this information and if they've, had any rebuttals to any of this.
Not that I'm aware of, no. I haven't specifically directly heard from anyone. I have sort of through other journalists reporting on some of the findings in the book, gotten a glimpse of, their general response to some of the major investigations of the book. One of which being that, especially when it comes to the reporting on ghost artists, the reporting on PFC, one of Spotify's responses has been that this material only accounts for a small percentage of total listening on the platform. It's interesting to compare it to in 2024, there was an article on Music Business Worldwide talking about how the previous year with on-demand audio streaming services, the entire genre of jazz got less than 1% of total streams, and the entire genre of classical got less than 1% of total streams. So a streaming service might say, well, jazz and classical, just a small percentage of total streams, not really a big deal. But to people who listen to jazz and classical, who make jazz and classical music, people who are like deeply invested in these histories and traditions, like it's not a small thing for, this practice to be impacting a small percentage of total listening. It's a big deal to the artists that are impacted by these practices.
Yeah. I mean, this was, such a big book. Again, you interviewed more than 100 sources for this book. This book is, more than 200 pages long about all this research going into Spotify. I'm curious if you just have any just final takeaways, things that really struck you along the way, or things that, if someone hasn't read this book, but a KEXP listener is very invested in independent artists, like anything that you want to say, just, the big takeaways that either you found or that you want people to know about how Spotify works and functions.
Something that is really important to me is the ending of the book. The last 2 chapters of the book are really focused on artist-led interventions into big streaming and also ways in which artist communities are imagining alternatives to these systems entirely, and not just alternatives to the idea of streaming, but alternatives to the idea of the corporate music business. And I think that some of the examples, like towards the end of the book, of ways of musicians self-organizing, creating cooperatives and collectives, solidarity organizations, unions, offer a different way of thinking about like what it looks like on a grassroots level for artists to sort of like come together and either imagine or work on alternatives. And then towards the end of the book, I also get into kind of like the role of public funding and libraries and, the idea, what would it look like if we lived in a world where there was basic income, not for artists, but for everyone? And like, how would that change the sorts of conversations that we have about the relationship between creative labor and capital?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you talk about the Union for Musicians and Allied Workers. They've done a lot of movement for things that they'd like to see change at Spotify. For example, the Living Wage for Musicians Act was announced in 2024 that would change up, proposed to change up royalty streams so more money would go directly towards artists. And then you talk a lot about how local libraries have been in this game of having streaming services within their own library system, specifically that focuses on local artists. And they've been doing this for a while now, especially in Iowa or places like Ann Arbor, Michigan. And finally, Liz, my final question, quick kicker question for you is KEXP, we're all about music discovery. So I would love for you to give us a music recommendation. What is a song that you think everyone should hear?
Oh, wow. Let me pull up my Bandcamp. That's the digital music enclosure that I'm stuck within. Okay. I really love, well, hopefully it's okay with you, but I love the new album by X Void, who are from the UK. And the Tubs. These are both bands that are former members of the band Joanna Gruesome, who now are in new bands. And I've been listening to both of those albums basically nonstop. So yeah, that's my recommendation of the day.
Amazing. Well, I've been speaking with Liz Pelly, author of Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is a deeper listen from KEXP. I'm Emily Fox. And we just heard from Liz Pelly about Spotify's various practices over the years that have devalued independent artists. But there was one independent musician that Pelly wrote about in her book that has been able to make a living and continue to make a living off Spotify, despite all of the recent changes and practices that have been happening over the years. I caught up with him to hear how.
Hey, I'm Lance Allen, and I'm a fingerstyle guitar player out of Nashville, Tennessee. I have a family and a house and do everything I can to make a living with my guitar in hands.
How many kiddos do you have?
I have 2 boys. One is 15 and 10.
Amazing. Take us back. How did you start gaining traction on Spotify, and what did it kind of take to gain traction there?
It was actually kind of by mistake. I teach guitar, or I've been teaching guitar for a living for a lot of years, and one of my online students said, "Hey, your song is on a Spotify playlist called Acoustic Concentration." This was during one of our lessons on a Saturday morning, and I was like, oh, cool. I had no idea. I thought Spotify at the time, this was probably 2017 or 2016, and I wasn't a subscriber to Spotify or knew anything about it. So I knew I got a little bit of money from them through my distributor, CD Baby, at the time, but it wasn't anything significant. And he said, yeah, you should start seeing some extra money there. And I was like, okay, we'll see, because I wasn't so sure. But a few months later, I got a royalty from being on Acoustic Concentration. And it was basically a editorial playlist that supported guitarists like myself. And it was nice to see that. And I was like, whoa, there's probably some opportunity here. And that's when I began my research on like how to succeed as a musician on Spotify.
In 2024, based on your Spotify Wrapped, you had 16 million streams on Spotify. So you started to gain traction, and you still have traction there. So what did you learn about like how to make it work on Spotify? Because according to this book that Liz Pelly wrote about Spotify, you were able to start eventually paying your mortgage through Spotify streaming royalties, and bought a new Subaru Outback, or bought a Subaru Outback.
Yeah. So I think what happened was I started Googling, and I found a book called The Slotify Method by this guy named George Goodrich. Is basically telling you how to succeed on Spotify with playlists. And I had no idea what was going on. So he gave me a copy of his small book, and I read through it, and I started doing some of those techniques basically where I would search up a Spotify playlist. And then this is like not an editorial one. It's one created by a particular person. So say John B has a guitar playlist, and I'd look up John B on Facebook or Instagram and shoot him a message and introduce him to my music. And I would do that for, like an hour a day for several months. And after some traction, it's just started to take off. And I think what happened, Spotify noticed, and I started to get some editorial placements along the way.
And an editorial placement means that you are placed on an official Spotify playlist, correct?
Correct. Yeah. One of them that I chased after heavily, and we can talk about this one, is Peaceful Guitar Playlist. And Peaceful Guitar was kind of like the Peaceful Piano. It's like the big playlist that has the millions of followers. And I was chasing it after that one early on. And I did land on it, and I had up to 3 songs on there. And that's during the time I was paying my house off and bought the car and all these things, just to kind of help life out. And that was through this Peaceful Guitar Playlist. Acoustic Concentration was nice. It was the start of that. And then Peaceful Guitar was kind of like I did something there.
So if you get it like on an official Spotify playlist that has, millions of followers, you can really start to see some payments come through.
Absolutely.
But how did you find like who to reach out to at Spotify to start pitching your songs to them? Because it seems like there's probably a lot of gatekeeping there.
Yeah. At the time, there was no. Now Spotify offers a pitching tool for artists called, the Spotify for Artists, and you can pitch your songs. But then that wasn't a thing that was available to me. So I was actually using LinkedIn to find people that worked at Spotify. And somebody out of all of the random messages I sent suggested me contacting so-and-so. And at the time, it was a Google spreadsheet or a Google form, I think, that I could fill out to pitch my music. And that's how I ended up on Peaceful Guitar, was through the Google form pitch. But they don't offer that anymore. It's all through their website called Spotify for Artists, which is basically marketing ideas for artists. And, you can control your what your bio looks like and pictures and things like that.
Interesting. So how long did you really start to see a ton of royalty payments come in, to the point where you were able to buy the car, you were able to, pay your mortgage bills? Like, how long did that last for?
That was probably like till COVID hit. So I was on Peaceful Guitar right up until COVID.
So how long were you on Peaceful Guitar? How long were you on that
From
playlist?
2018 probably to 2020. So that's a couple of years.
Wow. Okay.
And I can say that I earned, probably more than $10,000 a month from being on that playlist as well as other playlists. Because like when you're on a playlist, people notice and they save the music to their own playlist and profile, and they listen to it, whether they go back to peaceful guitar or not. It's automatically saved. And so it sort of snowballed from there. And that was a good couple of years of that. And it gave me a really good, leaping off point to where when they came off of the peaceful guitar playlist, I wasn't really affected financially, I still had like a fan base and followers that would receive my music on release radar.
So did you kind of put all your efforts into this playlist game, or were you still like teaching guitar or doing other things in the music realm outside of just relying on royalties?
Yeah, I was teaching guitar pretty full time. And what I mean by that is like 40 to 45 students a week doing half-hour lessons. Mm-hmm. And I started to like lessen off of that and not have to market myself so much for that, but I still taught guitar. Mm-hmm. And started playing the Spotify game.
Yeah. And it sounds like things have changed a lot in recent
Certainly.
years. I'm talking to Liz Pelly about is this idea of ghost artists or Spotify either working with some companies that kind of that produce quote unquote stock music at a lower royalty rate. There's also, some AI music that's sneaking into playlists too. So you're getting like stock music that's kind of made by companies. So you're starting to see less and less independent artists on these playlists. And at the end of the day, Spotify doesn't have to pay as much royalties when they're using this stock music. Can you talk about when you started noticing that trend and how it impacted you?
Yeah, it was pretty shortly after I got on the Peaceful Guitar playlist. In fact, when that playlist first came about, it had people on there that I knew. Like, I knew Tommy Emmanuel, who is a famous fingerstyle guitar player like myself. And he was on the list, and it was short-lived. And then all of a sudden, these pseudonym artists start showing up. And one time I noticed they had one of the artists had a record label labeled at the bottom of their song release, and it was called Epidemic Sound. So I was like, oh, I'll check out this company. And I contacted them to see if I could possibly work for them. And I discovered that I would have to give up my performance rights royalties on all of my music to be able to work for them. So that was a big no-no for me. And that made me realize, oh, this is probably why Spotify is putting their songs in their playlist, because they're not paying performance royalties to these session musicians or whoever created the tracks. And the tracks are probably owned by Epidemic Sound. I also discovered another label or something like that called Firefly, and those guys kind of did the same thing. So when an artist works for them, they actually give up their royalties or back-end publishing royalties, and those companies buy out the songs, and they probably have an agreement with Spotify that allows them to get those placements.
And it sounds like this is becoming more and more prevalent. Comparing when you started at Spotify, started getting on these Spotify playlists to now, how much has changed? Like, what do you think it takes to be successful in the streaming era today versus when you started gaining traction?
Sure. So at the time I was on Peaceful Guitar, there was probably 75% ghost tracks, or we call them fake artists because there's no indication that these are real working artists.
And this was back in like 2017?
This is probably, 2018, somewhere in there, yeah. And at that time it was probably 75%. And that was kind of the same thing for Peaceful Piano as well. And now it's probably 99% tracks on those types of editorials. And basically, the thing that I've done is to like kind of succeed on other streaming platforms like Pandora, Apple. So I've kind of focused more on that here lately because they give a lot of artist tools, and it's kind of hard to cheat the system on some other streaming systems or streaming services. And I still pitch my music to Spotify. I've probably had 100 releases in the last couple of years, and I've gotten maybe on 2 editorials, but not Peaceful Guitar. Those are the ones I kind of aim for, but sometimes I end up on a like a smaller editorial playlist.
So are you still paying off your mortgage through streaming royalties?
Yeah, my house is paid off now.
Oh, from those previous years of, I mean, are you still getting like a decent income from streaming?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And not to like brag or anything, but like 2 years ago, I set a goal for myself because I was kind of financially set up, and I set a goal to buy a Rolex watch with my royalties. And this was like because I wrote a song called Rolex in Blue. And just this last weekend, I picked my Rolex up.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, it's just a crazy thing, setting goals. And it wasn't just Spotify that helped that, but it was all the work that I put into it.
Overall, like, what are your thoughts on what it takes to be successful in the streaming era? Is it all about playlists, or are there other methods that can work?
Oh, yeah, there's lots of other methods, as far as using social media and YouTube and TikTok and all the places. There's I think a lot of artists don't realize how much legwork you have to put in to succeed in the streaming world. It's not just releasing a quality song and hoping for the best. You have to put in a lot of legwork. You have to have a following and an email list and make sure you're typing up these beautiful emails and learning all the tricks to SEO and websites and stuff. I mean, there's a lot to it, It's not just making music. Usually people that are making music and maybe they have a label to help. Sometimes labels can help with that stuff. But I'm completely independent. I own all my masters, and somehow there's little successes and they just kind of snowball and they keep going,
Amazing. Well, Lance Allen, thank you so much for your insights today and sharing your story. I'm curious, is there anything else that you want to add that we didn't get to?
Yeah. Like as far as consumers go, you may not even know about these ghost artists on Spotify playlist. I always encourage people to listen to actual artists, because a lot of these artists have created their own playlist, and a lot of times they support other musicians on there as well. So always just see if they have a bio, they have a picture or a link to Instagram on Spotify. Authenticity is really important, I believe, in an artist world. And if they're authentic, they've definitely got a bio and a picture of themselves or a story behind their songs. That's where it's at. And that's how I think it's a good way to support real artists out there.
That was independent artist and guitar player Lance Allen. And that was A Deeper Listen. A Deeper Listen is brought to you by KEXP, a publicly funded independent radio station. We are one of a few radio stations where DJs play whatever we want. We don't have predetermined playlists that are mandated from the top down. We are not algorithm-based. We are all about the human connection and music. And most of the music we play comes from independent artists. If this is a station that you can get behind and A Deeper Listen is a show that you value and want to support, I'm asking for you to subscribe to this podcast, rate it, and review it. It helps spread the word about this show so we don't have to rely on marketing or advertising dollars to get the word out. We rely on you. You can also financially support this show and the work we do at KEXP by giving $6 a month at kexp.org/deeper. It is a beautiful funding model. The people who love what they hear give. It allows KEXP to be independent. It allows us to be beholden to listeners, not corporations or advertisers. Again, you can give at kexp.org/deeper. But most of all, thanks for taking a deeper listen.